Funding for the Stoller Report is made possible by a grant from the First American Title Insurance Company of New York. The First American Corporation is the nation's leading diversified provider of business information products and services that impact the major events of people's lives.
Welcome to the Stoller Report, Real Estate Trends in the Tri-State Area. My name is Michael Stoller. Everybody wants to live in New York City. Where are they living? Where are they finding apartments? What are they finding? Rentals? Are they finding condominiums? And how are people able to live in the city of New York, the Big Apple? Today I have a group of 6 individuals who are the leaders in building residential housing in New York City. My guests include Veronica Hackett, Managing Partner of the Clarett Group, Joel Breitkopf, Principal of Alchemy Properties, Robert Veradian, President of Allied Partners, Thomas Lydon Jr., I'm going to give you the Junior, President of the City Investment Fund, Hal Fettner, President of Sidney Fettner & Associates, and last but not least, Fred Harris, Senior Vice President of Avalon Bay Communities. Certain people are saying, we're having the market is falling, prices are declining. What's really happening? I mean, Ronnie, you have 4 condominium developments being built in Manhattan today. You have 1 in Brooklyn. What do you see happening? Has the market declined a little bit? What's been happening in the last couple of months?
Well, I think the history of the market is the fourth quarter of 2005 was really a very almost dead part of the market that we weren't used to. We'd had such a frenzied of a market for several years, but we experienced, I think, across the city a really dead part of the market. And the first quarter, we've seen a dramatic
Now what do we mean by a dead market? I mean,
very little traffic. We would typically, today we're getting 25 or 30 people a week into a project, into look. In the fourth quarter, we'd be lucky if we'd get 4 or 5 people a week into the project. And we had virtually no sales. And I think that was across the board in the city. And
Joel?
I think
it was extremely quiet for us. There were trickles of people. Brokers show up at a lot of the broker open house parties, but I think folks were traveling. I think there was a general sense of that the urgency that existed maybe 9 months ago in the middle of 2005, the beginning of 2005, that urgency seemed to dissipate, almost like hitting a brick wall in December.
But a lot of major news articles also about potential bust. A lot of negativity, affordability. I think people just pulled back and wanted to relook at what their commitments were.
You bring up the news articles. Even though I write, and I'm probably one of the most positive writer with regard to the real estate market. But each day, the market is declining. The market is declining. This has had. How have the other people seen this with regard to? Do people really believe that the market is declining? People have to live here.
Well, I think that's what's changed this quarter, is that people realized that there was a general tendency to link the entire country in, quote, a bubble, and the media finally began to catch up with the reality of the quote, bubble was really limited to certain non-New York City markets, and that New York City began to be written about and reflected by the writers about the true difference between a place like Miami or Las Vegas or San Diego and New York, some very fundamental differences in the types of buyers, whether they're, it's a user, an owner buyer as opposed to a speculative buyer.
I'd like to throw this question out to the whole group. What is the profile of a buyer buying an apartment in Manhattan or Brooklyn or Queens? Because you're developing something in Brooklyn which you haven't done yet on the market. Joel's doing a project in Brooklyn. You're building Manhattan. You have Riverdale, Brooklyn, and Manhattan. Who's that profile? Is it a 55-year-old person? Is it a 20-year-old person? What kind of earnings
all
do
of
they
the
have?
above, all the above, depending on the location, depending on the community, and maybe the same project. You're selling to people returning from the suburbs, coming back to the city, buying a place to live. In the same building, you're having young families who want to stay in the city and raise a family, buying the same building. You know, certain locations probably our average age is lower or higher.
So what's the age?
The age ranges, from 25 years old buying a studio apartment in a conversion to people your age, Michael, a little bit older than 25 years old who are buying apartments.
It's always good to have people here of my same age together. I mean, Rob was saying prior to the show that one of the biggest problems of living in Manhattan is to get into these nursery schools, right?
Absolutely.
It's just children now, not Rob getting
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, and when we talk about who the buyer is, I still think on the Upper East Side, Upper West Side, and other various locations similar where the schools are, you're still going to get the 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom, 2 bedrooms. It is going to be a very inelastic market in terms of price points and what's happening going around, because people do want to be in Manhattan. They want to live here. They want to go to the schools, and they frankly have the money.
But we have this Manhattan. Hal is developing right now 2 properties. He's developing, and we'll talk about the rental later on, a magnificent rental right near Madison Square Garden, a 60-story tower with a Hope Lodge. And he's also going to be developing on 110th Street and 5th Avenue, a condo. What's the profile that you project, and what price do you see these units being sold at?
We
won't be upset that you took the property away from Ronnie.
It was the first right of refusal that we were able to exercise. But Ronnie, as always, was very gracious. When we bought that property, we always bought it with the idea that we were going to position it for those who could not afford to buy south of 96th Street. That was actually our original intent, and so we were always looking at it at a price point in the $600 to $700 a foot range. That was when, 56th Street projects were selling at $900 to $1,000. Now you're looking at these projects that are getting $1,300 to $1,500 a foot, and right now we're in the price point of about $900 a foot.
And Tom, you have a property.
We have a property in joint venture with Rob's former employer.
And Rob's still a principal, and that's
still a principal. And a little bit west of that, at Lenox, right on top of the subway, with the Athena Group. And there, we're looking at 1,000 plus. All the apartments there have views of the park. Buyer there, young professional couples who can't afford 3 bedrooms on Fifth Avenue or Madison or Central Park West. Price points for larger apartments under $2 million, with easy access, 2 stops to Times Square, and a very pleasant environment and very improving in the whole neighborhood. So we're very optimistic.
I also think there's going to be a big empty nester demand for that kind of apartment. Great location, park front, at a price point that is affordable versus the rest of the park that you can get. So I think that's going to be a secondary source of demand coming in from the suburbs.
Mm-hmm. We have, it's nice to talk about buying, but people can't afford to buy. So then you have the 800-pound gorilla, and I only joke with Fred, because Avalon Bay today has Avalon Christie and the Bowery. Right. Then you're building in Long Island City, City Lights.
Avalon Riverview.
Avalon Riverview. And then you're building, you announced last week that you're going to be building on Morningside Heights right next to the cathedral.
Right.
But you don't build any condos. You only build rentals. Why do you only build rentals? And then Hal is going to answer why he built some rental too.
Well, I mean, I think Avalon, Avalon Bay is a public company. We're a little differently structured than private groups, and we're a real estate investment trust, and we actually have declared ourselves to be in this business of rental apartment housing, and it would be possible for us to do other types, but we would lose the tax advantages we have by being a REIT. I think that a lot of what you were saying before sort of the underlying strategy of Avalon Bay is to confine itself to a very small number of markets in the country, New York being the most recent one that we've entered.
But you've gone
they're
into
all
New York
high-
and you became a gung-ho. I mean, so many, I mean, I'm only talking Manhattan. You have New Rochelle, you have Long Island, you have all of these, Eastchester, Bronxville.
But
You
they've
have all
also
of-
done some deals that have 4 or 5 years in the making, like the
Right.
Bowery
I mean,
deal.
I mean, it really has been an 8-year process to build a pipeline of development that's similar to what went on in other regions of Avalon Bay. But we generally build without any leverage. We build rentals. Our perspective is long term. We're looking for properties that will be, they'll be evergreen, that will be always convenient places to live, and people will rent them. And I think that, our view is that the market rate, the pure market rate rental world is actually remarkably underserved. I mean, it's a really important part of any regional economy that there's rentals available, so that people can move in, people can move out, people can form families can break up, and that's so that it's really, there's a very high demand. I mean, our properties are very full, and it's very regional. I mean, the conditions we see in Manhattan or Long Island City or New Rochelle, it's much more single market than a lot of people think. I mean, if you're building a certain kind of product, you'll get a very similar profile in any of those places.
And you talk about the product. I mean, Joel's company really was there before on the Bowery, when you built the property over there on the Bowery. I mean, you took a property which was a vacant lot for a parking lot.
Let me interrupt you and say that one of our biggest criteria to doing that job was the fact that Avalon Bay, we knew at some point down the road, a year or 2 years down the road, was me building 400 some odd apartments. So from the standpoint of, we built the first condo in NoHo probably ever, I suppose, at least at that point. It was a ground-up development. Originally it was supposed to be, by zoning, 8 stories, including 2 office space to max out the zoning. And we figured that the demand for 8,000 square feet of office space with 8-foot ceilings on the Bowery is probably not the best at the time. So we chose to do less square footage and do 11-foot ceilings and not build as much space internally. But a key part of that whole financing concept and putting the deal together was the comfort, if you will, that Avalon Bay was going and building, acres of real estate within 2 blocks.
I mean, tell my audience what that property is. I mean, I went down there. It's a very interesting property.
Well, the city basically offered the last 4 sites of the Cooper Square Urban Renewal Area in an RFP in 2000, and ultimately it was, the RFP required that you build 75% market rate, no more than 75% market rate, 25% affordable, and that it comply with a bunch of restrictions in terms of building heights, that you include a 35,000 square foot community center. I mean, there was a whole laundry list of things that were happening, preserving a community garden. As we went forward on that, the real challenge of the first building, which is almost half the project, is 361 apartments, 85,000 feet potentially of retail, and what turned out to be a 45,000 foot community center, all in the first building. And one of the reasons that land had been vacant for so long was that the B&D trains were extended diagonally across that site in a 4-track tunnel in around 1960, and that's when the site was cleared. And unlike almost every place else in Manhattan, that subway tunnel just sits in the dirt. It's not in rock. It's not anchored to anything underneath. And because it's so wide, you can't span it from an engineering structurally. So we actually had to rest on this tunnel, and that supports the building. And that was a very that's not a permission that's very easy to get, and it's very complicated. But I think that we actually look for very difficult, big assemblages that can really be transformative, because that creates value for us. We're going to stay there as a long-term investor.
But when you develop the site,
really helps.
You develop the site without knowing that you would have the largest Whole Food in the city of New York. I mean, you had 85,000 square feet of a supermarket.
We almost cut out the second floor of retail to get some higher ceiling heights.
How big is your Whole Foods?
The Whole Foods is actually going to be 65,000
That's
feet.
bigger than our building.
Because they sliced a hole in the floor and took out over 15,000 feet of floor area so that they can have an central atrium.
Right, but it was originally supposed to be like 80,000, right?
It was, yes. Well, and literally we signed the lease during construction, so we re-engineered this on the fly. But it'll be the largest grocery store in Manhattan, and we were literally on the verge of signing leases with three other retail tenants. The typical drugstore, a small grocery store, and it was really when Whole Foods had opened in Columbus Circle and they were open in Chelsea, and they looked at this and they were already under construction in Union Square, and by every conventional measure this was too close, and they knew. 2 years before they opened Union Square, they said that store is going to be completely overwhelmed by the demand. And I was talking to them about maybe take a quarter. And they said, and I said, well, sort of almost as an offhand comment, why don't you just take everything? And it was like,
it was a good deal
happened.
for you. But, you bring up the affordable component. The 25% affordable.
Right.
How's building a building? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your property that you're building on top of the sanctuary, the church, and the mission?
We bought a property actually 4 weeks before September 11th, 2001, with the Franciscan Friars. This is actually Father Michael Judge's parish. And we are now building a rectory for the Franciscan Friars, approximately 35,000 square foot rectory. We're also building a Hope Lodge for American Cancer, as well as some office space. And the Hope Lodge is basically an adult Ronald McDonald House. It happens to be a spectacular use, and if any of your viewers are watching and would like to donate to ACS, they could use the money. And this is really to help patients who need to get out care in the hospitals but can't afford to stay in hotels. And then my first residential floor will start on the 13th floor and rise up to the 60th floor.
And within the tower, you have how many apartments?
We have, in that building, we have 448 apartments.
And of the 448, 20% of them are assigned to affordable
Units.
And that is 60% of the area median income, up to 60%, or is it?
Which you just blended two different.
Okay, so it's a combination.
Okay. Yes.
You have a certain portion is at 20% of the area median.
You have a deep skewed. Okay, so it's different income levels.
Right. So certain people are going to be lucky to win the lottery in your building, and how many people applied on the Avalon Christie?
Well, it's a little deceptive. I mean, we had 26,000 people sent in letters for the 72 apartments in the first building, but it turns out
it's a good lottery,
Well, but the qualifying those people is actually a little bit of a sub-industry. We actually hired a not-for-profit housing company, Phipps Houses, that went through this, and to get those 72 selected residents, I think they went through close to 1,500 applications. So it's actually, the lotteries attract lots and lots of response, but the percentage of responders who are actually meet all the qualifications is not so high.
And then somebody wins the lottery, truly wins the lottery, and they can be renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Avalon Christie for $650 or $681 a month, and someone else is paying, a market rate person is paying $4,200 a month.
Yeah, or more.
Or more.
And that's a rent-stabilized lease for as long as they want to be there.
For the low-income resident, it's essentially it's sort of more than rent stabilized. Right. It's really tied to the
30% of their
to the bond financing and tied to their income level. So it's essentially a very low rent for as long as they choose to live there.
There are discussions today. Ronnie, Rob, everyone builds, and you build by something what we'll call a 421A, which is a tax abatement. It's a phased-in tax abatement. And there are discussions by certain community groups to get rid of these 421A tax abatements. Let's get into a discussion of, tell my audience what the 421A does and what's the benefit to a purchaser or to anyone over there.
Well, the benefit to the community at large and to affordable housing is that we as a luxury developer, we buy certificates, we buy from a developer who takes that cash and builds affordable housing in other locations in the city. So to me, and in exchange for that, we are entitled to phase in our New York City real estate taxes over a 10 or a 20-year period, depending on the location. So I think that it's a terrible idea to get rid of it, because I think it's a significant factor in the production of affordable housing. So that it's an easy argument to say, oh, luxury buyers can't afford, I mean, you know, they don't need any tax incentives, is obscuring the argument that what that luxury building is allowing. And I think if you go back and you look at what affordable housing has been built in all of the boroughs in the last 10 years, a dramatic percentage of it has been because of luxury Manhattan developments.
I think on house building, the new building, and the Victory that you built a couple years ago, and Avalon's building, if you didn't have the 421A tax abatement, your rents would be much greater.
In our buildings, we get the 421A. I mean, just to be clear, most of the city currently, if you build a residential multifamily building, you get a 421 abatement as of right, whether there's affordable housing or not. There's an area called the exclusion zone in Manhattan, which is what Ronnie is talking about, where you don't get it, but you can buy certificates.
Right, that's 14th Street to 96th Street, correct?
Right.
It's roughly. But I think that when you do an 80-20, and I think actually there is no passion on anybody's part to get rid of 421A for 80-20 developments. 80-20 developments essentially self-entitle themselves to it by including affordable in that project. And I think that, if you, from a financial point of view, of all the benefits you get by including affordable housing, 421A is by far the dominant one. Without it, I don't think there'd be any 80-20 buildings in the city.
But there have been articles saying it's like Robin Hood, taking from the rich, taking from the poor and giving to the rich. I disagree with it. That these people who are buying condominiums in your place or your place in Brooklyn or your Riverdale or something else, they don't need this.
No, the answer is, again, remember, part of the growth and the great things going on in New York City, why people want to live in the city, is that families are able to stay. And someone buying a one-bedroom unit in a new, quote, luxury project is not a wealthy person. It may be a single person or just married person earning a good income, but they can't afford to buy a property with paying full taxes. This gives them the opportunity for the first few years to buy in, stay in New York City, raise a family in New York City, and as their incomes go up, they can afford to pay more taxes. So it's far greater than just the taxes on the building. You've got to look at the construction jobs created. You've got to look at the opportunities for people to stay in the city. It has far greater impact every place. So
I'm going to get looked at with the devil eyes here, but I take a little bit of a different point of view. I think where construction costs are, and from the rental point of view, I think it's absolutely necessary for people to build where costs are and to get a proper return on their investment. The 421A is appropriate. I think for some of the luxury condominiums, the people making out are the landowners. When it was originally conceived, the city was in dire need of building more housing. Today, when you see land prices $300, $400, $500 a foot for even in Tribeca, that landowner's basically making a windfall on the backs of the 421A, because if the unit owner was paying more taxes, theoretically they would be paying a lower price, which could be afforded by the developer because the land cost would be lower. So I think I take a little bit more of a bifurcated view.
When you built 90 East End Avenue, you didn't have the 421As.
We didn't have 421A because the property didn't qualify for the tax abatement, because there's also a requirement of replacing a multiple of the units that have been demolished. And so we didn't satisfy that requirement. It actually did have an impact on us, and in fact, our sellout was longer than we expected because we went through a lot more buyers, prospective buyers, who looked at what the carrying costs were going to be over the long term and said, I don't know if I can afford that. And that's why I agree with Tom. If you look at who the buyers are right now, it's young people whose parents are putting down the down payment to buy these apartments. So that's great. They can afford to buy the unit, but they can't afford to maintain the unit, which is where the tax abatement comes and helps.
We had the 420 tax abatement on our building on the Bowery, and we also have it on State Street off of Brooklyn Heights. And for those buyers at that time, what are not necessarily prime Manhattan locations, it helps a lot in terms of financing the projects, which does lead to construction jobs. It also helps just in terms of the overall affordability. In our Chelsea jobs, where we're building from the ground up, we built one on West 22nd Street, and we're doing a couple now. We have purchased these certificates to make our buildings, more competitive, more attractive. It costs a lot of money, obviously, but those monies go to the affordable housing sector. So I don't think there's so many cases where it's just giving more money to the rich. I think that it's an important factor for sure in the affordable housing.
It's a huge savings account for the city. I mean, all this housing production that's being stimulated. I mean, the 421A is very stimulative of housing production. There's no question about it. But all of these abatements have terms and they run off, and the future tax revenue that the city is building. I mean, this bulge of housing production that we're seeing now is a little unusual. I mean, it's really been a while since housing's been built at this level, but this housing will go on the tax rolls in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, depending on which category you're in. And the future value is really staggering. I mean, it's really very important to the long-term future of the city, and in all the debates about it, I haven't really seen people talk about what wouldn't get built if it went away. And I think, you look down the road 10 years, 11 years, I mean, when these things start expiring, especially these high-value areas, I mean, in one sense you say they may not need the subsidy, but that condominium at Madison and 68th Street or some other prime address, that single condominium is going to start paying $30,000 a year in taxes in 15 years.
And the city does not forget to raise the assessments every year while that's going on.
Let's leave Manhattan, and let's talk about people say they can't live in Manhattan anymore because the prices are too high. You're building in Brooklyn. You're building in Brooklyn. You're building in the Bronx. You're building everywhere. What's everybody's opinion of Long Island City?
Well, obviously,
the biased person over there.
We're about to have invested $250 million in Long Island City. We're very happy with Long Island City.
But you're different. You're on the water. You're in a unique site. You're in the Queens West area. I'm talking about the Long Island City of I hate to say the gritty Long Island City. Where the buses stop from the prison in Queens. No, and they do stop over there, and where you have the topless bars, and you have the different thing. I mean, do you see this portion of Long Island City? I mean, I think Rob brought it out. People are crazy. They think their land is worth anything. I mean, I have a site in Long Island City. I want $250 a foot. I mean, there's nothing out there yet.
There's been a lot of trading of land, and certainly land prices have risen, but you haven't seen people, other than the waterfront sites and the strong builders, really be building and selling. I met today with a company. It's an out-of-town company. I knew the president, who's in a deal at one of those locations in Long Island City, right at a crossroads of two subway stations. Perfect strategic location, and he was really not a New York builder, but was in a very favorable position of saying, what should we do? Should we build one of these condominium towers and sell out for $700 or $800 a foot? And I said, I would say probably not. The answer is you're going to be competing on this for sale with Queens West, with a lot of very strong excellent builders in Long Island City in some very prime locations that are going to bring on thousands of units, and you can include that competition working your way down into Greenpoint, into Williamsburg.
Yeah, let's get
so
to.
you better be at a very low price point.
Williamsburg. Everybody wants to be in Williamsburg. You have a limitation on the subway. The transportation isn't that great. They don't have a Whole Foods yet over there. Red Hook, they're going to have the Fairway.
They will. Whole Foods will be in there in one of the projects that are being built.
Do you think there's going to be overbuilding in Williamsburg?
I have to say, I really don't see overbuilding, not just, regionally. I'll go further out on a limb than just the city. I think that the thing that's changed over the last 5 or 6 years has really been the consumption of really the last open land for development within sort of a big ring around the city, maybe 50 miles out. And so as that's happened, there's
Ronnie, interrupt him. Don't worry.
There's been pressure everywhere.
Please, I wanted some interruption.
You're trying to create some disagreement, but I don't disagree with them.
I don't think the region, neither the region nor the city is growing that fast, but I do believe they're both growing relentlessly on a big
I disagree
base.
a little bit. Just going back to Long Island City, I think that, and maybe the Bowery is a good example, kind of good comparison, a Manhattan version of Long Island City to some degree. There were no topless bars in the Bowery, just homeless shelters. But I think you need the rental housing first to establish the critical mass before you have the condominium people come out. And Long Island City is arguably, except for some prime areas, a while away from that. I think the amount of buyers that are going to spend $700 a square foot or $800 a square foot to make the numbers work on a condo basis, there aren't that many buyers. There aren't that many people who can actually, you can't build for less than a break even of, let's say, $600 a square foot or more as a condominium developer, unless you're getting an Avalon Bay, wait 8 years to do the deal type deal. And the problem with we've seen in Greenpoint, particularly Williamsburg, is that you've got people trying to sell land for $200 a square foot, which brings and for all said and done, your average break even is going to be $600 to $700 a square foot. And so if you can sell for $800 a square foot, which is not demonstrated, you'll do okay, but you have better margins in Manhattan. The problem with Williamsburg and Greenpoint, particularly Williamsburg, is that you've got families owning the land out there in prime locations for 20 to 40 years with a zero basis. And so us as a developer, trying to be creative, going out there where we're paying $200 for land when a guy next door is literally has zero basis, we can't compete. So if there is a flight to quality and some type of downturn of any significance, or the buyers disappear, we're hurting and they're doing great.
But unfortunately, these people who own this land for all these years, they're not the people developing the sites.
They're joint venture, or some of them are.
But I think it also goes to the issue of how many buildings are going to be built at any one time. There aren't very many people who build huge multiple buildings at once, so that and the discipline of lenders and financiers tends to restrict the amount of supply that comes on in any one year.
Right, and it's true what you said. New Rochelle's a perfect example where, we built one 425 home building. Now we're building rental,
right?
And then and building 588 next door, 39-story building,
but you'll never build those together. You build them sequentially.
All these condos started developing, and they were all moving out of our building. But basically, I think I think that one of the nice things about rental housing is it can be built in a very large scale, in a pushing the neighborhood envelope, and can have an enormous effect on what goes on around it. And I think that's part of what I think the city needs to do, and I was very self-interested, is push, that's setting that's sort of the seed capital that really can transform a neighborhood much more quickly than people that have to sell people not only on spending, their life savings on a place, but also taking what's viewed as a chance on a neighborhood. It's a harder sell.
No, what Fred just said is absolutely correct in that we invest for our family. And you started before asking about why we only do rentals, and it's primarily to create a cash flow. And we always look at deals from the very simple adage, there's some number that someone will always move into one of my apartments, and I can always remain 100% occupied.
If you remember my first show on TV, you were on the show, and you were the apartment developer, and I had an office building, and the comment that you made was great. He said, I don't have to worry about an entire floor leaving as a tenant. If I have one tenant leave, I'll find another tenant. If I have an office floor and this internet company goes out of business, I'm dead.
Plus you have to spend money to get the next guy
Exactly.
in first.
You don't see-through apartment.
You paint it.
I could always be 100% leased at any time if I want to be.
And you know what's interesting? Tom's company, over the last 2 years, has acquired 4,000 rental apartments. And why would you buy these apartments in Prospect Park in Brooklyn and up in the Bronx? I mean, why?
Why? Because we're buying from owners who haven't reinvested money in the properties. These are in neighborhoods that are improving economically, not spectacularly, but working people, families who can afford and want a little better living circumstance. So we're basically going in and doing capital improvements, in apartment improvements,
New windows, new kitchens,
windows,
new
new
bedrooms.
boilers, and over time, through natural vacancy and some tax advantages and some ability to pass on improvements over a long period of time, you're able to take a two-bedroom apartment and take it from $800 to $1,000, and that family can make the money to be able to afford that. And we think that's a good investment. We also think it's a good reinvestment in the city of New York overall for moderate income families, which is part of our motives. But it's also a good investment, and you have very good financial sources for that too. The savings banks are all over New York are very good suppliers of capital to finance that type of enterprise. And for that, we like to do that and try to catch neighborhoods. Maybe you will sell those properties to someone who will convert them to condominiums later on, or sometimes you'll do it yourself.
But relating to that, Rob was talking about their property on top of Studio 54, and Ronnie on your property on Central Park. You have a lot of people, and also you have people who are buying rental buildings, and you're buying these, like the Wellington, you're buying these rental buildings and you're planning to convert them.
That might have been the biggest business, the last 5 years, the biggest business in New York City from the volume of transactions is the desire to be an owner and the whole process of conversion. It's unbelievable. Every week that you see a new name who's doing a conversion of a major property. The financial backing for these enterprises has been tremendous, and I'd say to date, 98% of all these projects have been extremely successful, and the buyers of these properties have also been able to realize benefits through appreciation also. And it's a big business. We'll continue on. There'll be a lot of conversions in the next couple of years, but it's driven up the price of buying a rental property to a very high level. So it's very hard to be an investor in buying, in Manhattan especially, to be a long-term investor and buy. Hal can't do it. He has to build it in order to get the return to do that. And Avalon Bay, the same thing. But it's
an interesting phenomenon that New York is different than the rest of the country. I mean, the rest of the country, if you look at the relationship between rental and sale housing, it's exactly opposite here in New York. It's 30% of sale, owned homes as opposed to 70% rental. You'd find it the exact opposite. So I think that conversion business has been fueled by more people becoming owners, just the natural progression, and clearly fueled by low interest rates and the ability of people who were renters to be able to rapidly become owners and the financings that were available.
Joel, you took a lot of these buildings which were, I don't want to call them walk-ups, but some of them were walk-ups or brownstones, and you converted them. You made them into condominiums.
Well, primarily our business before we started doing some ground-ups was converting commercial buildings. We were involved with a few walk-up buildings, but the commercial building market where you could buy a building for $100 a square foot or $200 a square foot in places like Chelsea that were at the time burgeoning, those days are over to the extent that those shells or those buildings now cost $400 a square foot, if that, maybe more. And there is, at some point, I mean, middle-class housing in Manhattan, for example, prime parts of Manhattan, middle-class housing is a different animal than any other part, of the country. So where we sold out a building that had been a office building, actually the building on 19th Street that we're converting, about 6 months after 9/11, actually part of the building blew up. There was a sign company that actually they were mixing certain things, and part of it blew up, and now actually the owner of the building, that's how they actually vacated the building. Everyone had to vacate because every federal agency in the country came in and thought it was a terrorist act. So that building became vacated, and we did a thorough renovation of the property and went to market about a year ago in March of 2005, and we had 500 people for almost 70 apartments. And we had people coming to our offices and dropping off letters saying, if I can't get 1A or 2A, I want 6B. If not that, then 3C. And 9 choices, sight unseen. And we thought, this is great. I guess we're really good at what we do. But the reality was, at the time, there was a supply issue in the city. But what was most ironic, I thought, or most telling about that point in the market was that the common refrain was, we can't find a one-bedroom in Manhattan for less than $1 million. And at the time, if we had 500 one-bedrooms to sell at the time, we could have sold out in a day. And that's a strange concept, when Ronnie was at Chemical Bank back in the 80s, and I was there as well. I remember, someone was underwriting $600 a square foot to sell at the best location on Central Park West, and the deal was turned down because no one had ever seen anything beyond $400 a square foot back then. And so middle class housing, the concept, in Manhattan is a world unto itself. But there are limits.
Rob developed the site on the west side, 63rd Street. You last year in 2003, 2004, you did one on 107th Street. What happens? The west side seems really hot today.
Oh, I think it's the west side is probably the least amount of inventory coming on, because it's been very hard to get sites. It's been very hard to find sites and put them together. I mean, and the bulk of new property on the west side was the Trump Yards for years. I mean, it was...
Probably still is.
It is.
Yeah, it has all the fundamentals that you want, of infrastructure, transportation, schools, and very difficult to find sites, and you still don't see a large amount of inventory, and those are the kind of fundamentals.
I think yes.
No, I was going to say, but you know what? If you also look at the reports that have come out in terms of the appreciation of rents, and you look at the rent appreciation over the last 2-3 years on the Upper East Side versus the Upper West Side, right? The Upper West Side is getting greater rent increases than the Upper East Side. The Upper East Side used to be the holy grail. Right. It's not
Is that
anymore.
because it's starting at a lower point and had a longer way to
No,
go?
it's
or
that
is it-
people, people are
absolute rents are
rediscovering
lower.
the West
Absolute
Side.
rents are lower on the
And I
east
think it
side.
had a little more way to go. I thought there was a lot of catch up there, which was justified.
Is it
Well,
Time Warner?
No.
No,
Time Warner is a different.
Hal's
That's
talking
not the
about
Upper
rents.
West Side.
He's,
I'm talking about rents.
talking about rents, not even
Rents.
sale
Okay.
prices.
Rents.
No, I'm talking about the critical
whole
mass.
perception of the critical mass and people wanting to be
huge
closer.
investment on the Upper West Side and Lincoln Center area.
I think it's just, you know what? I think it's a whole slew of issues. I don't think Time Warner hurt the Upper West Side. There's a cachet that wasn't there 7, 8, 10 years ago on the West Side that's there now. And the Upper East Side has that stodgy, older, more established families.
My
Don't
theory,
tell me.
my theory is my theory is that you want to get away from a certain age group wants not to be where their parents were or are.
There's a lot of truth to that.
That they want to be,
Now, having said
not
that,
next
my
door
ni-
to mom or dad.
94th and 1st at Chesapeake is a young person's building.
But on rental, up in the York Avenue, I mean, the Glenwood properties are all younger. I'd say a number of them.
Yeah,
The
but
Buck
those-
property, the new property on 92nd Street, which was sold 92nd and 1st, your property on 94th. a lot of those are younger and they're less expensive.
They're younger, but it's still a different tenant profile. On 94th and 1st, then you take the Victory, 41st and 10th. Very, very different clientele.
Are rents higher at the Victory than the Upper East Side?
Rent are actually higher at the Victory than the Upper East Side. Absolutely.
But the occupancy is probably higher
Considerably.
too.
I'm 100% leased.
It's always, yeah. It's always.
But,
You know, prior to the show, Ronnie was saying that banks are becoming a little more cautious today.
I've always felt, being an ex-banker many, many years ago, I think banks are a lot more
Lydon was
disciplined.
once an ex-banker, too.
I know. I think banks are a lot more disciplined than people give them credit for. And I think that they're in all the construction financing that we've seen and all the lenders we talk to, there's very solid, strong cash equity ahead of them. And I think that what's happening today in the market, so they're very disciplined in terms of, and they don't really bend their rules. I mean, they have a certain...
And they're much more astute. The group of people they have, they're much more astute. They're much more in tune with the market. They go out in the market. I can call my bankers and they can tell me more about a market than I would know, even though we're investing in the markets, because they're looking at, every one of us are going in there and telling a different story, trying to do a different project, and they're gathering all this.
But when you were bankers, all three of you were bankers, people would not lend you more than 75%. In today's crazy world, you can get up to 90%.
Well, not really from the construction lender. You're talking about different levels of...
I'm talking the stacks. But you can get up to 90%.
But that's an equity investor. It's the equivalent of having an equity investor partner.
But it's changed the market,
yes.
Ronnie, and the answer is it's given a lot of developers who don't have equity tremendous opportunity to take on numerous projects. I happen to think, when you do get a downturn or rates go up, I think the real risk is not that the projects are bad projects, but all you need is a 6-month slowdown and higher interest rates. And if you have 3 projects going versus 1 project, I don't think there's a lot of depth in the equity of a lot of these small and mid-sized guys. And when that happens is when you have the developer credit problems cause problems at the project level. This won't happen with the big type developer, but that's what I worry about a little bit. And the market gains a little bit of a bad reputation, and it's really because they're stretched too thin.
Well, you recall back in the 80s, the late 80s, early 90s, but maybe particularly the middle 90s, that there were no condo construction lenders out there. There were 0.
Very little.
And Chorus Bank out of Chicago started to do some things, and none of the local banks were doing anything. Maybe a couple of banks, but Bank of New York for a long-term relationship, or things of that nature. All of a sudden now you've got, we were financing a deal back in the late 90s or mid 90s. It was, send out to 20 people, maybe 2 people would make offers. Now you can have 20 offers easily. Obviously different terms, and then you've got all these other mezz lenders out there. So financing-wise, discipline-wise, I would agree that people actually do have institutional memory. People do remember the 80s.
Right. In the 80s, we had the Japanese. They were a big lender. They lent money.
A lot of office buildings.
A lot of office buildings.
But they were almost all money.
They were office. But you had money going out. There was a lot of money going out. And then the savings banks gave out too much money also. Some of them, the S&Ls were really that situation. Then you have, right now, you have this proliferation of the German banks who are the big lenders.
And they're very aggressive. Yeah. They're very aggressive.
Right.
It's a huge capital surplus, really, is what it amounts to, and it's basically
equity also.
And this money, a certain proportion of it wants to be invested in certain kinds of real estate, and residential is viewed as the least risky sector, and so I think you do have. You do have a lot of money flowing into New York looking for.
But that's perceptively changed in the last quarter, the last 6 months. The lenders are on the construction loan side. They're dealing with their best customers. They know what the markets are. They're not going to overfinance. They know exactly what units should sell for. And on the investor side, you might have had 15 people a year ago that would clamor for a deal. There are now, 4 or 5 serious investors.
I think Ronnie's absolutely right. I'm seeing in the last 6 months, people are going with the best builders, the best developers. They're being more discreet about their projects. A year, 18 months. I'm talking about the condominium sector. there was a real gold rush to it, and I think people were a lot less discreet about builder experience, character issues,
Location.
a lot of things they
Location.
overlooked
No, I was
over a
just,
project.
Fred's point is exactly correct, as well as Ronnie's, which is the banks love the rental product even more than they love the condo product. And when we went out for financing on 31st and 6th, we really are, right this very moment, one of the only true rental buildings under construction at this very moment. There are some other rentals, Rose has one, but we are one of the larger pure rental projects. We actually did a roadshow where we had the banks come to us one at a time and then handed them a term sheet and said, this is the term sheet that we want to sign. They looked at us like we were nuts. But at the end of the day, every single bank beat our term sheet that we had set and gave to them.
Because of what we said before, there's a dire need for rental housing.
That's right.
But it's a safe
It's a
loan
safe harbor.
for them.
Right.
And
And they bought the apples.
What's that?
And the banks all bought these apples
But,
here.
you know, people come, to this equity man who's an investor. Well, what's the profile? Who comes to you? You got the people, you have the...
I do.
Right. No, you have the established, and then you have these
tried.
We do.
people
We tried,
who have no experience. So they come to you and they say...
It's all right. You know, you have the wealthier families. You don't see them. They have their own kind of capital and their friends and family. But even the public companies, not Avalon Bay as much, but Toll Brothers, Hovnanian, they're all finding, even if you have all this capital and all this financing, they don't want to take all the risk themselves. They want to be able to spread their risks around. And so we're dealing with anywhere from an SL Green, a big REIT, has plenty of capacity, could just borrow all the money, to 3 women, one of which is an old friend of mine, Gentry Hoyt, who just left Shorenstein, buying a retail play in downtown Brooklyn. Right? And they just are starting out in business. So we deal with a whole range of, that's a small situation, a big situation. For us, it's a matter of who the people are, number one, and the opportunity. And that's what it is. So, and that comes in directly, relationships, brokers, anywhere, banks, or just coming to something like this and meeting someone. So,
Well, they're the only capital partner out there who only focuses on
New York City.
Right.
And so they've got a unique advantage and a tremendous perspective.
hopefully, if I think even if the market turns, we'll still do business in New York. Maybe that's...
You know, we were saying before, we were talking about construction costs today, and Fred, I couldn't believe what Fred said. He's building a building in Long Island City at $240 a square foot, the construction cost, and Ronnie was saying that you're building $350 a square foot.
A little lower,
A little,
320.
$320 to $330. In this market, how can you build rental?
Well, Fred bought his job a long time ago. So
Let's say we find the property, and let's say hypothetically we're very lucky we can buy it for $100 a square foot.
in your dreams, $100 a foot.
That's right, in your dreams.
In
We
your
can't
dreams.
find Brooklyn?
You can't find Brooklyn
No.
at $100.
Can we
You
find
can't
a-
even find Brooklyn at $100 today.
135.
Well, if you go deep into
and you've
Brooklyn, you
gotta-
can find $100 a square foot, but those are not condominium areas.
You mean if we go into Crown Heights, if we go into Bed-Stuy?
Yeah.
Well,
or Brownsville.
but actually, even though
Brownsville?
in those areas,
Ocean Hill,
actually,
Brownsville.
some of those areas are getting pretty hot now, and so, but $100 a square foot, we haven't seen those numbers in a while.
I think there is. Getting to the heart of the matter, what we really are addressing is we've seen horrendous price appreciation in both land and construction cost, and it does have some significant and dramatic consequences for us as an industry and for us as a city, because it is increasingly difficult to build of anything other than, and there's a dramatic difference in the cost between a stick-built project, which 8 or 9 stories is about as high as you can go, and in a city that's land constrained, where you want to go up as high as you can to create density. There's a real disconnect and a real challenge that we're facing. So we're going to see the city and other users be more and more creative about how do they create land. It's going to take longer. It's going to take the 4 and 5 years. They're going to be more deals with institutions like churches than Hal and I have. Our Sky House project is a deal with a church.
It's hard to believe, but we have spent 58 minutes talking today. And I'm really happy that I think I got a good perspective of the market, which I'm pretty knowledgeable, and I think my guests gave the audience a good information. And I think New York is strong, and I think the condo market is strong, and I think at the right price point we're going to sell. I'd like to thank Veronica Hackett of the Clarett Group, Joel Breitkopf of Alchemy Properties, Rob Veridian of the Allied Partners, Tom Lydon of the City Investment Fund, Hal Fettner of Sidney Fettner Associates, and Fred Harris of Avalon Bay Communities for being here. Next month we're going to still talk about little residential and some unique types of residential products and maybe assisted living around New York City. Thank you. We'll see you next month.
Funding for the Stoller Report is made possible by a grant from the First American Title Insurance Company of New York. The First American Corporation is the nation's leading diversified provider of business information products and services that impact the major events of people's lives.